Yeah, so that's a perfect segue into talking about utopia and dystopia,
Yeah.
because I mean, I think at the core of the work that you've done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I want just to mention your book, Planet Utopia, for anyone who's tuning into this, and really encourage people to check it out. It's a really brilliant meditation, theoretical meditation on the paradoxes of utopia and dystopia in the contemporary world that we're living in today, which was, I mean, and in terms of a periodization, it's located right there where you were speaking, in that moment in the 80s and 90s, the end of history, which was a kind of inverted utopia. In a lot of ways, it was a utopia premised on the end of utopias. And so I guess I would ask two questions. One big, why is it necessary and important to think about utopia? And obviously it's like dialectical other dystopia in our, you know, historical moment. But also, could you sort of start to locate it and unwrap some of those paradoxes that emerged there in the early 90s, and why it's so important, especially for younger people? I mean, many of my students were born after September 11th. They don't even remember any of this, right? So so could you kind of, why is it important to locate at that moment, you know, in 1990, at the end of when the Soviet Union disintegrates and all of the end of history? Sorry, I'll stop. I'm going on for too long.
Well, I think the first question, why is it important to locate it there, is because, you know, particularly for me, growing up, becoming a kind of into academic and so on, and particularly my key influence, this kind of Marxist approach to understanding everything. Well, the way I saw the end of history was completely the end of thinking in terms of dialectics. So there was no longer any sense of class struggle or kind of historical change moving towards some kind of utopian resolution. So in the, you know, what you started to see in the late 80s and early 90s was this idea of globalization, post-utopian, post-socialist, no more big ideological change. Capitalism will resolve all of the problems of the world through growth, endless growth. The Soviet Union collapses, Russia takes on capitalism. The idea is that China will soon do the same kind of thing. I think, you know, at the same time as dialectics kind of collapsed as a way of, you know, in a sense, I think what that did is it took away the idea of future, and the idea of a future which is different to what we have now. And I think we're still kind of grappling with that now in a way, because if I was to ask my undergraduates, imagine the future, I think in a modern period of history, they would have come up with some utopian idea of, you know, we're heading towards a more egalitarian, equal society and so on, or at least they would have had some progressive idea of a future. I think if I ask them now, the future is always apocalyptic and catastrophic. And so capitalism as a force for it's no longer seen as a force for kind of progressive change. It's almost like taken on the form of a kind of Freudian death drive. So everyone imagines capitalism is now gonna destroy the world. And I think Frederick Jameson, in an article from a few years ago, says it's more difficult to imagine the end of capitalism than it is the end of the world. So I think in that context, you know, the utopian imagination becomes absolutely essential to try to kind of excavate it from being kind of lost to history.
Yeah, and actually that really ties in with one of the question that we had, because you mentioned, I mean, Alex had mentioned a lot of the students, you know, they've been born
Yeah,
after September
yeah,
11th, and
yeah,
you mentioned your undergraduates,
yeah,
right? That the future isn't progressive, it's
yeah,
apocalyptic. Because I mean, you're
yeah,
kind of already living within it right
yeah,
now. And reading your work, could you discuss the kinetic utopia dystopia that
yeah,
services in like the post 2008 period, right after like
yeah,
the financial,
yeah,
the Great Recession? And so
yeah,
we're actually also, I mean, we've been touching on this, but particularly interested in the politics of security and also this widespread nihilism that
yeah,
you identify.
yeah. Yeah, so I think that what I tried to do with the kinetic utopia was, in the context of this idea of post-utopia, I mean, that started to be spoken about and started to become kind of normalized around. There's a British kind of political theorist called John Gray, who wrote, I think the book's called Black Mass, where he announces the end of utopia and says, you know, there will be, you know, these kind of mass movements are over, and he connects that to, I mean, if my memory serves me correctly, he connects that to kind of Islamic fundamentalism and so on, and says, look, those utopian movements are kind of inherently fascistic, and we don't need them. All we need is kind of liberalism. And so what I was trying to do with the idea of kinetic utopia was say, well, all right, if you look back into the history of capitalism, you'll find that capitalism and this notion of a society of endless growth and development and the production of wealth and so on, in itself is based on kind of utopian ideas of how the economy will work, and it will produce endless prosperity and so on. There was a point in the early 2000s when I forget the name of the economist, but I remember Bono from U2 was part of this kind of end poverty movement. The idea was global capitalism will eradicate poverty around the world. And at that point, I could really see, look, these ideas are being taken seriously, but even at the time, it was obvious they were incredibly kind of utopian, in a sense, kind of theological. Obviously, looking back from the perspective we've got now, we can see quite how utopian those ideas were, because what started to happen soon after that period was we had, you know, as we've mentioned, 9/11, when kind of American global power and neoliberal ideas started to be thrown into question. And then we had the financial crash, and gradually, as time's worn on, we've had Trump, Brexit, globalization becoming less about mobility and kind of a kinetic utopia, and starting to become a dystopia of, you know, barriers, walls, an obsession with security. The other is now seen as a kind of dangerous, you know, threatening figure. So I think, yeah, over the course of the past, you know, ironically, it was almost at the precise moment American and British political thinkers started to talk about the end of history and this kind of global utopia of capitalism, that things really started to fall apart. 9/11, the crash, COVID was really part of the end of this idea of globalization. So I think we're on, you know, I tell my undergraduates when we study globalization, we're on the cusp of I think we're on the cusp of a huge shift.